Did you ever wonder what would happen if someone played retro shooters and horror games as a kid, and then made a game inspired by them? Well, Cultic is a game made by Jason Smith and published by 3D Realms. If you're a fossilized keyboard turner like me, then you've noticed that this game was inspired by the older build engine games, especially Blood, though looks may deceive. Now, Blood and its remaster First Supply is my all-time favorite FPS. When I've seen the trailer for this game, I was surprised and also very happy. And after playing and finishing Chapter 1, which is the whole story at the moment, I can say it's inspired by it, but it plays differently, and Blood isn't a good comparison. Thematically they are similar, but gameplay-wise not at all. But there are games that it took some bits and pieces from. The story is about a detective who's trying to solve a case of missing and murdered people in his county, but there were allegations of misconduct and he was suspended. He still decides to pursue this mystery alone, landing in New Grandwell. On his way to solve the mystery, he was ambushed and dumped into a mass grave. And that's where the game starts. First thing you'll notice is that it stands out with its visual design and graphics. The brown and gray color filter give the ambient a more dark and gloomy atmosphere. There's a mix of meshes and voxels which give the game a transitional look. One part is build engine nostalgia, the other is 21st century boomer shooter. And the gore is top-notch, especially in tandem with its great sound design. It delivers a satisfying experience. Though in some levels enemies are sometimes hard to distinguish, especially during gunfights due to so many things happening on the screen. But there are some accessibility options where we can, for instance, minimize the screen shakes and other things. Now we are introduced with our first weapon, the axe. Swinging it feels great, and it can be charged to one-shot weaker enemies, but it also can be thrown if you got a few more. We also have the bundle of dynamite from Blood, a must-have, but the throw is a bit weaker and how it's used is a tad different, since in Blood it's just a left-click and boom weapon, while here you need to light it up and then throw it, at the end giving it a different role compared to the one in Blood. Though the game also has a more direct one-click explosion weapon too. Pretty much all the weapons are from the mid-20th century, and all fill a distinct role with some overlay here and there. Though all in all, the arsenal is pretty varied and the guns feel great and useful. In some games, you somehow find a favorite gun and run with it. I did that with a pistol, but to my surprise, I was switching to other weapons as the way the enemies were engaged changes at a moment's notice. And with the upgrade system, you can also create your own build and weapon of choice. Though the only gripe I had was the weapon switching. Not in the choices, but the speed and clunkiness. You have to wait for a weapon to reload and finish its animation before you press your key for another weapon, so during the battle I'd be spamming to have my weapon switched. The gameplay feels great and snappy. The character can butt slide around, dash, or kick boost. This maneuverability is very useful due to the lack of hitscan weapons. As the cultists are shooting you, you can easily evade all of the projectiles. If I'd compare the movement to a semi-modern FPS I played in the last few years, that would be the Project Brutality mod. Now, Cultic is by all means a boomer shooter, and a good one at that. The combat feels fast-paced and there are moments of respite to soak in the retro goodness. The gibs are nice and chunky, and the headshots, especially when you trigger the slow motion moments like in Killing Floor, are on point. Since the game has the option to pick up stuff, we can use the environment to throw some barrels or lanterns into the faces of our hooded hoodlums, but also use them to find more harder to reach secrets. Now, the secrets aren't the most hardest ones, but also not on your nose easy. Most of them have noticeable visual cues which remind you post-fight that there was something in the past area. It also gives you some small tips in the first level on the default breakable boxes. And there are some secrets that aren't hidden, but require some platforming to get to them. The levels have a tendency to go from wide open exploratory areas to more confined ones, and the transitions are nice and slow, giving them a long build-up and execution. These combat breaks are abrupt as the music stops playing and the ambient sound kicks in, preparing you for the inevitable crescendo of blood and death. As for the game that really inspired Cultic, it's Resident Evil 4. Even the developer talked about it, that Resi 4 was a bigger inspiration than Blood. We can see that in the guns, for example, the C96 Mauser, or how Resi called it, the Red 9, the Chainsaw Mini-Boss, the minimalistic upgrade system, the Shield Cultist, the emphasis on hitting headshots, even the tension I've mentioned that gets cut by the brooding soundtrack is a thing that Resident Evil 4 did, though it does have the base of a build game as the developer did also play them, but there are a few sprinkles of other games. Compared to other shooters who have a tendency to use metal, rock, or some 80s synthwave, Cultic's music is leading the way with more symphonic instruments. The way they were made is that most of the instruments are compressed and only a few aren't to give a nicer contrast to the song. They adhere to the retro look of the game and just enhance the experience. It's an interesting concept as we are playing these retro games to remind us of the past, but since the song isn't all MIDI compressed instruments, the ones that are high fidelity are holding you down to the present. Playing more of the game, you realize the game differs from Blood. This is very important, as people tend to make games inspired by older ones and use the same mechanics and gameplay, which I'm not a fan of anymore as it's becoming very dull and saturated. It was interesting the first few years, don't get me wrong, those games are great, I just wish for more variety, though the chances are slimmer as the days go on. As for this game, the more you play, the more you realize it has its own identity, and that it's swaying away from people saying, oh look, it's like Blood. Even its level design and the way it's carrying itself differs. These retro shooters try to go over the top and most of them are always 80s cheesy action, with random movie references which I don't mind, but it's just too much in recent times. In this game the protagonist is silent, so we really don't hear anything from him, which is a nice change. A good chunk of boomer shooters tend to design the levels a bit more gameplay-centric than logical. Cultic, from what I gathered, is set in the 60s and all platforms and levels are rationally built. As rational as it can be in a boomer shooter, that is. The enemies in Cultic range from basic cultists with axes, various firearms and shields, to zombies, knights, snipers, Salazar, meat abominations, poltergeists, Dr. Salvador, and even a tank. All of them were introduced in a nice pace, keeping the game interesting, and later on in the game, the enemies would be in some kind of berserk state, boosting their speed and rushing towards you. The environment, depending on the scope and size, changes the tempo. More bigger areas keep the pace fast and explosive, but then when the rooms get smaller, the games become more brooding and creating tension, sitting on the fence between retro shooter and light horror game. The levels are varied and offer enough to never make the game boring. They're pretty much expected environments, from dark forests, villages, mines to underground crypts, but they still keep it fresh. Even the map design doesn't allow for the aforementioned gameplay that Blood offered. Blood did have run-and-gun moments, also large levels that turn into confined areas, but you'd always swing a few explosives in there before getting in. The one thing that it has in common is the backtrack and secret exploring. But this is a more general characteristic of build games, although the second part of the game had more close quarters and were similar to the scenarios in Blood. I finished the game in around 2.5 hours, and my gameplay most of the time was to find maybe a third of the secrets and kill almost all enemies. Though the game does offer a survival mode, and if you're a completionist then you're gonna be searching for all the secrets and enemies in the level to get everything, so there's a good chance it's going to take you more than 2 hours to finish. As for people still comparing it to Blood, Blood's gameplay, at least a good chunk, was lobbing dynamite around corners and using it more frequently. It's a very important tool in Blood, as in Cultic it's mostly a utility item. The hit scanners were also dominant in Blood, and in Cultic they are absent. It's not the hit scanners per se, but in Blood you would try to dwindle down the enemies by bouncing dynamite in the next room, and then try and kill the rest that's alive. In Cultic, the enemy engagement is totally different, and these two things were one of the main construction pieces of Blood's gameplay. With all the mentioned differences, Cultic to me is distancing itself even more from Blood. If you're looking for a Blood game and if only the theme is enough for you, then you found your game. Gameplay-wise, the only way this game can be a bit similar is if you play on extreme difficulty. The game all in all was a treat. All elements were of high quality and there were no major issues that hindered my gameplay. The game kept a solid frequency of interest throughout the whole chapter and I can't wait to play the second one. I do hope you liked this short video. Another longer video of a childhood favorite is coming soon, so stay tuned. Do subscribe and like if you enjoyed it. What was your favorite FPS in your childhood? I'd love to read it in the comments. And as always, my name is Dark. Thank you for watching and goodbye.